I'm convinced that God has a sense of humour. When I booked in today to speak with Moy earlier in the year, we had no idea that this would be the week that we moved house. So the last 3 days we've been moving house, unpacking boxes, short nights of sleep, and, I'm sure that God just wants to prove and refine our characters just that little bit more. So this morning I was getting ready, got dressed, had my socks on. I went to put my shoes on, and they were nowhere to be found. So at 10 o'clock this morning I was rummaging through a whole number of boxes until eventually I found a pair of shoes. I thought that would, a bit nicer than just turning up in bare feet or whatever. So anyway, we made it after quite a week, but God has been good all the same. Today I just want to talk a little bit about identity. For me, identity and belonging are all really critical things. And I was really blessed and inspired by the spring service that was held here a couple of months ago. Was anyone else? There's something really powerful about hearing people's testimonies. I think it brings us together as a community and we're able to share together. When I think about identity, or when you think about identity, what do you think about? What are the things that when people say, who are you, what are the things that you're inclined to say, to speak about? Often we reflect on our birthplace. And for me, my birthplace was Launceston, and so I've got a connection with John up the back there. And as soon as I came in, when I first became an Adventist into Launceston Church, John was a member. So when I came into Burwood earlier in the year, it was really great to connect with John. One of our removalists who helped us move this week was also not from Launceston, but from Tasmania. And so as soon as he worked out I was at Tasmania, he wanted to talk about Tasmania. There's something about a connection when you can identify with somebody else, when you can connect with somebody else that it just creates those bonds. Identity can also be connected with cultural heritage, our country of origin, our family of origin. Some of my mother's ancestors were on the First Fleet. Some of them chose to be, some of them didn't. But I can identify with that history. I'm a pastor. That is part of my identity, but it's not all of my identity. When I go places and people say, oh, what are you here for, or what do you do? Introducing yourself as a pastor can either be a conversation starter or a conversation killer. Sometimes you've just got this really pregnant pause, this awkward silence when people don't know where to go with it. Other times people really want to connect with you. I was checking into a hotel in Adelaide a few weeks ago, and the Filipino lady checking me in, when she found out that I was an Adventist pastor, she wanted to tell me about the wonderful Adventist hospital in Manila and this Adventist doctor who helped her family out so much. She wanted to connect. I had an electrician come around a couple of weeks ago to quote on some stuff in our new house. And when he found out I was a pastor, he wanted to tell me that he was a Christian and that he had a really great mate who's an Adventist who lives out in Yarra Glen. His name wasn't Murray, that's okay. And I could tell you lots of other stories. During our spring service, I was really inspired by Wayne's story. You were there, Wayne? Yeah. And the way your fitness carried you through. I really connected with Lisa's testimony. I don't know if Lisa's here today. I've been meaning to catch up with her. But I was also adopted, and so I could really resonate and understand what Lisa was sharing through her own experience as part of her identity and connectedness. And Elena, I was just really praising God for what God has been able to do in your life. And having had quite a troubled childhood, teenage years myself, I could connect with that and really sense the miracles that God has done in your life. And so identity is a really powerful, powerful thing. And one of the things I really like about Burwood Church is that it's a safe place to come in and explore your faith and to belong in your brokenness, in your struggles, in your journey, whether you've got it together or whether you're falling apart. Wherever you are, you can come and be here at Burwood. And I think that's a really great thing. And that's really, for me, a big part of what the Gospel Commission is all about, isn't it? There are so many people in our communities that are experiencing brokenness, that are experiencing challenges, that are wrestling with their identity, that need a sense of belonging. And because as Christians, we have got the Gospel Commission compelling us to share our faith, to tell others about Jesus. Sometimes that's with words, sometimes that's with actions. The way we live out our faith gives us a chance to connect with those people and to relate to them. Earlier in the year, I really enjoyed the weekend that Tim Gillespie was here. Who enjoyed movement? There were some of you here? Yeah. I love the way he was able to unpack the Adventist faith and talk about some of our distinctive beliefs, and that he was proud to own them and identify as a Seventh-day Adventist minister, and how he's able to express it in a contemporary way. You know, when you think about identity, it's an interesting time in Australia to be a Christian. When you think about all that's going on in society at the moment, popular culture is marginalising Christianity. In many places, it's just not cool to say I'm a Christian, or I believe in many different things. We live in an era that is increasingly hostile toward Christianity in general. Issues such as the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse and other failures of the Christian church have not helped that view. So in an environment where as Christians we are increasingly on the margins of society, in a society that often mocks and ridicules Christians on television, in newspaper, social media, how do we connect with our own identity as Christians, as Seventh-day Adventists? Do we recoil? Do we hide and say, well, we won't tell anyone that we're a Christian unless we absolutely have to? How do we respond? What does that do to our values and our practices and the way that we go about living? I have a friend in Sydney who is a creative strategist and a copywriter, and he happens to live in Newtown, a very trendy inner city suburb of Sydney. And he was telling me one day his 9-year-old daughter goes to the local public school, and the teacher was ridiculing Christianity in class on that particular day. And then the teacher happened to stop and say, "Are there any Christians here?" And the little girl kind of said, "Yes, I'm a Christian. I go to church." She's an Anglican. Anyway, the conversation ensured there was no other person in that class that even knew a Christian or had knowingly met a Christian. And so for that day, she became the class curiosity, as people wanted to ask her all these things. Well, what does it mean to be a Christian? And so this little 9-year-old girl became the centre of attention because none of her classmates had ever realised or known a Christian personally. It was really fascinating. You know, we're not the first believers to live in an increasingly hostile environment of faith. We often treat the stories in the book of Daniel as really good children's stories. But there's some really powerful adult stories in there as well, as we relate to how to live out our faith every day. How what we do on Sabbath impacts the way we live the other 6 days of the week. And I want to just go through and look at a few verses. You know, we don't live in exactly the same kind of era that Daniel and his 3 friends lived in. You know, we haven't been hijacked and taken to another country and put in a completely foreign environment. But the environment that we live in is being changed, is being transformed around us, even as we watch. You know, in Daniel chapter 1, I'm just going to look at a few verses of Scripture. In Daniel chapter 1, the first story that I just want to read a few verses of is what is, on the face of it, a very simple test, a very straightforward thing. And we kind of wonder, well, was it really necessary? Was it important to do that? And as we look at these verses, I'm going to just pick up a couple of verses here. Verse 3 says, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. So there was quite a few of the young Jewish boys who had all been brought together to the king's palace. In verse 5 it says, the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years and then they would enter the royal service. And then in verse 8, I'm sure you know the story, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. So already most of the young Jewish boys that have been brought into the king's palace had sort of said, oh, that's not a big deal. We'll let that one slide. We'll just blend in, we'll just fit in and it'll be okay. But Daniel and his three friends said, no, this is important. This is about loyalty to God. This is about worship. This is about principles that are important to me. We're going to stand up and be counted on this one. And then we move on to the next story I'd like to pick up, and it steps up a gear. It gets a little bit more intense in Daniel chapter 3. And I'm sure you know it. Again, it's something many of you would have picked up through Sabbath schools growing up, when you've got the Nebuchadnezzar's big gold statue. And I just want to read verse 12 and verse 18. It says, but there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. And then we'll come down to verse 18. And this is their response. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. So again, we're getting into these areas of identity, loyalty, and worship. And then I just want to pick up a third story very briefly in chapter 6 of Daniel. So he's serving in a new kingdom under new rule. He's serving Daniel now in a very supportive environment. And again, I'm sure most of us know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, verse 4. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. Now, they're good traits, aren't they? They're good values to have. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. Interesting, that was the only area that they could pick on. And verse 10, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. So he was unmoved by the threats against him. He wasn't willing to change his behaviour. He wasn't willing to change his practices because of a secular decree, because of a government decree, but he kept doing what he'd always done. Now, you probably wouldn't have blamed him if he'd shut the doors to avoid, being picked out, but he was willing to stand strong in his faith. And whilst we haven't been forcibly taken into exile like Daniel and his friends, we are being taken hostage in a subtler way. And that is through a subtle shift in ideology that's going on in the Australian context at the moment. We are shifting from what we have traditionally had in Australia as a soft secular society to a hard secular society. And let me explain the differences to you very briefly. The concept of a secular society is a political theory that defines the proper relationship between the state, the government, and the church or religion, and maintains that separation and sort of establishes a framework in which that happens. If we look at a simple explanation between the two, we find that a soft secular society leads to freedom of religion, freedom for the church to do what it needs to do the way it wants to do it without onerous restrictions or limitations. And a hard secular society leads to freedom from religion, that is, pushing religion to the side, pushing it into the corner, and not welcoming Christians to speak into the public square. Soft secularism comes out of the American Revolution, and it respects the separation between church and state, but the state values the contribution of the church, and the church is welcome to be part of the public discussion, the public square, so that it can bring values and morals and beliefs into setting up the framework of how we live in society. Hard secularism has its roots in the French Revolution, and it essentially pushes the church to the margins of society and that the church should not have a voice at all. Hard secularism is, according to one writer, unreservedly antagonistic to religion. To summarise, I'll just keep going. So historically in Australia, secularism, soft secularism that is, did not require the removal of religion from the secular space. And if you look at the Australian Constitution, very briefly, Section 116 talks about that Australia cannot mandate a state religion. So no one church can be lifted up and said, this is the standard, everyone needs to go to that church. It says, no, we will separate that. We won't have a state religion. We'll let people choose which religion they want to belong to. That's what a soft secular society does. It doesn't require the removal of religion from the secular space, civic life, education or public debate. So to summarise, let me say that soft secularism is tolerant of diversity and leads to inclusion of the widest range of voices in the public sphere. And that's really the kind of society we want, where people have the right to be different. People have the right to practice religion or no religion at all, to live lifestyles of their choosing without being shunned or pushed to the margins because of it. Hard secularism is intolerant of diversity and leads to the silencing and exclusion of voices that differ from the currently defined state-sanctioned morality. Hard secularism seeks the complete separation of religion and state, which can only be achieved if all religious voices are barred from participating in the state or are forced to compromise their beliefs. So in Australia, we have long enjoyed a soft secular society. We've had the freedom to practice our faith, to live our faith however we like, and that's been a wonderful thing, and we've probably at many times taken that for granted. But what we're seeing is right across the spectrum of church ministries in Australia, those freedoms are being eroded. And just in the last couple of years, quite a few limitations have been put on the work of ADRA and aged care through issuing of policy and directives from the government that are really constraining and will continue to constrain the operations of charities and retirement villages. If you've been following the media, there's growing pressures on schools to not be allowed to operate according to the tenets and beliefs of their faith. And so the environment we are living in is changing rapidly. One of the roles that I get to do in my work is to make submissions and speak to government in collaboration with others about these kinds of things that are taking place in society. Another part of my role that gives me that I work in is assisting students who are experiencing discrimination in their education environment, usually in tertiary, usually in universities. And this year I've been supporting a group of 3 medical students in one of the universities in Australia who have been told that unless they complete a particular practical exam on a Sabbath, I think they're in their 4th or 5th year of their degree, they will fail medicine completely. It's a core unit that they must complete. The good news is that just a couple of weeks ago they won that battle, and using the university's own anti-discrimination stuff, they eventually won that, but it took them 9 months. They made 4 separate submissions to the university through the appeals process. They engaged lawyers who gave them advice on a pro bono basis, and we wrote a number of letters as a church just for them to be able to uphold their beliefs on the Sabbath. They had to go through such an ordeal to do that, and I can tell you many stories of discrimination, particularly around Sabbath, as students come up to major exams. I guess as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that the Sabbath is a really pivotal issue. And as we get closer to the return of Jesus, the Sabbath will become an even more pivotal issue. So I guess one of the challenges, it comes back to our identity, our values, our principles. What are the things that are really important to us? What are the things that we as individuals have made decisions that are non-negotiables for us? Maybe some of us may have decided, well, I'll just do this one exam on Sabbath. I don't want to create waves. It'll be all right. God will understand, and He will. Or where does the crossing point? What are the things that we have to stand up and say, I stand for God, these are my beliefs, these are my convictions? Or do we just go along with the flow of society and, just allow the environment to change around about us? And it's a real challenge as Christians, as Seventh-day Adventists. How do we live out our faith in 2018? How do we demonstrate our identity in an appropriate way? That we don't push people away, that we don't burn people off, but we draw them closer to Jesus by the way that we have these conversations. What is it that drives our daily living, our decisions and our priorities? How do we live out the gospel commission of Matthew 28 to go and make disciples of all nations? It's a real challenge. For me, to be a Christian is to do more than just belong, although belonging is really important. And as I said earlier, I really enjoy belonging here. But as part of belonging, it means identifying with Jesus Christ and His sacrifice for me. It means identifying with that call to live out my faith through actions and through words so that we can influence other people's. As I conclude today, I'd just like to change tack a little bit. But as I've wrestled with identity, as I've wrestled with faith sharing and living out faith over time, one of the things that we started developing while I was still in Sydney was a resource to help us as believers share our faith, to be witnesses, to fulfill the gospel commission in very practical, meaningful ways. And so out of this desire, out of this burden, we have developed a series called I Am. And if you're at the youth rally a couple of weeks ago, you probably saw Simon Gigliotti launch it. And I know, Joel, you're working with a group that in a couple of weeks will do a formal launch of the I Am series. And if you want to know anything more about it, speak to Joel or myself. But it's, I believe, a really powerful way to introduce Christianity to people, to share your faith, even to confirm your faith and give you confidence in what you believe. And I'm really excited about the potential of it. It's been a few years in development, and was launched in Sydney formally at the beginning of September, and starting to be launched around various parts of Australia. So I'd like to just conclude this morning with showing you the trailer, and I know that in a couple of weeks' time, Joel will have a lot more to say about I Am. God bless.
Your entire life consists of weighing up choices, whether it's the career you pursue, where you choose to live, or the friendships you make.
But then there's always a thought, do these things really make us happy?
I was working at Goldman Sachs at the time, living in New York City, perfect view, and everywhere I went, there was a driver waiting for me. To everybody around me, I was living a dream, but I felt like something was missing, a deep need for something more.
So I had many questions growing up. I just really wanted to get to the bottom of the truth.
I knew that there was something looking after me. In fact, I called it the thing. I'd say to people, the thing's happening.
By the time I got to university, I was sort of like the persecutor of Christians. I was pursuing questions of the universe. Where did the universe come from and why are we here? My head is like in turmoil, and after I prayed, it all ceased. There is a purpose for life.
When Jesus found me, that's when my life began to change. I just felt this, just a heavy load was lifted up off of me. It's the most beautiful thing about the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I thought as a Christian and as a university graduate, I shouldn't believe in something that I couldn't back up.
I've been a Christian for 25 years, and I never really asked for the Holy Spirit. All of a sudden, just like Peter, I wanted to start sharing about Jesus, what he'd done for me.
I hear this voice. All I need is your time. I created time. I can get everything done that you need done if you give me your time first.
The I Am series is a chance to uncover the true meaning and purpose for all of our lives. It's an opportunity to examine the evidence for who Jesus Christ really is and what his death and resurrection means for all of us. Join us as we explore the difference that Jesus can make in our lives. Register at iam.org.au.